So everybody, can we just sort of put to rest this sort of silly canard that Pope Francis is an enemy of capitalism or an advocate of, global socialism? It's simply not the case, and the evidence is right here. In the wake of Pope Francis' letter Fratelli Tutti, which is a contribution to the Church's social teaching, there was a good deal of controversy because people thought the Pope was somehow attacking capitalism, he was attacking private property. Well, the first thing about Pope Francis is he tends to speak and write in a more prophetic mode, so he's kind of out there in what he says. But nevertheless, we have to see what he writes here in the context of the whole of Catholic social teaching. And once we do that, we see that there's nothing really egregious in what he's saying. In fact, he's in line with the tradition stretching back to Leo XIII, coming up through John Paul II. First observation is he's not one-sidedly negative on capitalism, or what the Church tends to call the market economy. The Pope, like John Paul II, sees the moral value of capitalism. I just want to read you a couple things from the letter. He says this: business activity is essentially a noble vocation directed toward producing wealth and improving our world. Well, there he sounds like Arthur Brooks. He sounds like an advocate of the market economy as the means that has lifted more people out of poverty than any other economic system in history, which I think is simply the case, and the Pope is admitting it. Moreover, he says, even something like profit-making has a certain moral value. Listen, in God's plan, each individual is called to promote his or her own development, and this includes finding the best economic and technological means of multiplying goods and increasing wealth. Okay, that sounds to me like someone who's advocating capitalism, advocating the market economy. He cites several times in this letter Pope Leo XIII, who strenuously opposed himself to socialism. So everybody, can we just sort of put to rest this sort of silly canard that Pope Francis is an enemy of capitalism or an advocate of, global socialism? It's simply not the case, and the evidence is right here. Now, without gainsaying any of that, I want to talk about what's maybe the most controversial part of the letter. It shouldn't be controversial, though, to anyone who's familiar with Catholic social teaching, because the Pope puts all of this legitimate approbation of capitalism within the context of the idea of the universal destination of goods. Again, a principle stretching back well into Catholic history. And let me just read to you how he articulates this very important principle. Listen. The right to private property, which he's just been affirming as a moral good, is always accompanied by the primary and prior principle of the subordination of all property to the universal destination of the earth's goods, and thus the right of all to their use. That's Pope Francis' way of stating this venerable principle. Trust me, everybody, he didn't invent this principle. You find it in all the papal teaching of the last century or so. And it goes back to my intellectual hero, St. Thomas Aquinas. If you want to find the passage, it's in question 66 of the Segunda Secundae. That means the second of the second. So the second part of the Summa, which deals with the moral life, is divided into a first part and a second part. So in the Segunda Secundae, the second of the second, question 66, if you want to find it, you'll see his distinction between what he calls the ownership of private property and the use of private property. Do we have the right to own property? Yes, says Aquinas very clearly. And that's why the popes have reiterated that principle. But, says Thomas, in regard to the use of what we own, listen now, in this respect, man ought to possess external things not as his own, but as common, so that he is ready to communicate them to others in their need. That's the principle. Private ownership, yes indeed. Market economy, absolutely. Profit making, no problem. However, all of that is put in the context of this great principle of the universal destination of goods, or the use of private property for the sake of the common good. Now, to be fair, Thomas Aquinas didn't invent this distinction. He articulates it very clearly, but it goes back to his patristic predecessors. Let me just quote a couple here, cited by Francis in Fratelli Tutti. Here's John Chrysostom. Not to share our wealth with the poor is to rob them and take away their livelihood. The riches we possess are not our own, but theirs as well. Now, notice please, the riches that we possess. He's not denying private property. But in terms of their use, the common good must always take precedence. Here's from Gregory the Great. When we provide the needy with their basic needs, we are giving them what belongs to them, not to us. Same idea. So we provide the needy out of our private property. We're not denying private property, but we're giving them what ultimately belongs to them and not to us. Now, to instantiate this, if that sounds too abstract, I think we can do it with a simple example. Imagine now you're tucked in your bed late at night, inside the house that you legitimately own, which you have legitimately locked against intruders. But to your house comes someone desperately in need of food and protection. And they're knocking at your door in their desperation. Would you say, oh, no, wait a minute, this is my private property, you got no right to it, I'm not going to get out of bed to serve your need? Well, no, of course not. In that extreme situation, you'd say, well, no, let me share with you some of my food, some of my clothing, some of the protection that I have. We're not denying private property, but in that circumstance, this principle of the universal destination of goods obtains. That's what the popes here are arguing. That's what goes back to the church fathers. You know, if there is a novelty in Francis, I'd say it's this: taking this principle and applying it now not so much to individuals in relation to each other, but nation states in relation to each other. Are there richer and poorer nations? Yeah, sure. Do nations have a right to their own property, their own goods, the protection of their borders? Yeah, of course they do. And the church has always maintained that. However, is that right inviolable? Well, the answer clearly is no, because of the universal destination of goods. Do certain wealthy countries have the obligation to share of their wealth with those who are poorer? Yeah. Now, again, you see why this is always the case with Catholic social teaching, is it cuts against both the left and the right. Against the left, it defends private property. It defends the right of a nation to its own integrity and so on. But against the right, it calls for this universal destination of goods. That's why when you defend Catholic social teaching, as Pope Francis does in this letter, you tend to get attacked from both sides. Let me just close with this because I mentioned him already, but the founder of the modern social teaching tradition, the great Pope Leo XIII, look at the opening moves in that letter. He ardently defends private property. He marshals, I think, 5 or 6 arguments against socialism. There's no stronger proponent of private property than he. But then listen to what he says later in the letter. When what necessity demands has been supplied, and one standing fairly taken thought for, it becomes a duty to give to the indigent out of what remains over. That's Rerum Novarum, paragraph 22. If I can, that's somewhat convoluted translation there, but once the requirements of necessity and propriety have been met in your life, well, what you have left over belongs to the indigent, belongs to the poor. Both are affirmed. Private property, yes indeed, and the universal destination of goods. I think once we see that principle, we see that Pope Francis' recent letter is not egregious, not some exception, but is right in line with this great tradition. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, I encourage you to share it and be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel.